So coincidences happen all the time, but what do you call it when 3 separate planes are hit by lightning, dogs, baboons, and tigers attack, and an assistant literally loses her head, all during a single film shoot? Some events align so precisely that the entire thing feels like bad fiction, but it's not. Starting college can be life-changing, but for 2 students, total strangers, who happened to enroll at New York's Sullivan County Community College, it was life-changing in a way no one could have imagined.
Sullivan was a community college. This wasn't some long-standing institution of higher learning.
They enrolled a year apart, but when Robert Shafran got there, everyone seemed to think they already knew him. He finally figured out there was a former student who looked just like him, so he went to meet the guy, Eddie Gallen.
He had the same grin, the same hair, the same expressions. It was his double.
Shock of shocks, they were twins, separated at birth. But that wasn't the whole story.
A friend of mine came up to me with a newspaper that had a picture of 2 of me.
A guy named David Kellman saw the story in the media and realized he looked exactly like Robert and Eddie. In fact, they were triplets.
I met myself. We met each other. We met ourselves.
And even that's not the end of the story. The triplets later learned that they were placed in homes through an adoption agency that was overseen by 2 psychiatrists running a study on nature versus nurture. They deliberately placed the brothers in families of different socioeconomic standings. What did they learn? Well, for starters, it's incredibly traumatic. Gallen died by suicide in 1995, and the remaining 2 brothers have spoken about their mental health issues stemming from the discovery and fallout. To make matters worse, they were just one of many sets of twins and triplets who were part of the experiment. There's an old saying that lightning never strikes twice, but it turns out that it does. At least it did while production crews were trying to film a movie about an unsuspecting couple raising the Antichrist. Technically, it struck 4 times. Lightning hit the planes of Gregory Peck, executive producer Mace Neufeld, and writer David Seltzer in separate incidents, and narrowly missed producer Harvey Bernhardt. Weird? Hold this proverbial beer. One plane that was nearly chartered for Peck ended up not being needed at the last moment, which was a good thing because it crashed, killing everyone on board and people in a car on the ground, who just happened to be the family of the plane's pilot. There were also 2 near misses related to bombings. Director Richard Donner was staying in London, and that just happened to be during the time of the Troubles, when the IRA and various Ulster forces were planting bombs, including one in a hotel where Donner was staying. Then there was the weird number of animal-related incidents. At least 1 person was injured when the film's Rottweilers attacked, and that baboon scene? Completely real. One of the trainers was even killed by a tiger the day after filming that scene. The film's Damien, of course, famously kills those he doesn't like. That included David Warner's character, who was beheaded in one of the greatest horror movie death scenes of all time. And it turns out there was an actual death by beheading. On Friday, August 13, 1976, the movie's special effects designer was driving with his assistant, Liz Moore. There was an accident, and she was decapitated. The location of said accident? 66.6 kilometers from a town in the Netherlands called Omen. Adolf Hitler boasted that his life was once spared by a British soldier named Henry Tandy, who had him in his sights on the battlefield.
Even though he's a trained soldier, he can't bring himself to pull the trigger.
That story doesn't really stand up to scrutiny, but what is true is that Hitler had his life saved a ridiculous number of times, starting when he was 4 years old. That's when a priest named Johann Kuberger plucked a toddler named Adolf from a freezing river in Passau, Germany. And that was just the start. Through a long series of strange events, an Irish man named Michael Keogh found himself joining the German army and crossing paths with Lieutenant Corporal Adolf Hitler. They were in the barracks in Munich when Hitler found himself on the receiving end of an angry mob out for blood. Keogh saved him. The decision haunted Keogh, as he later told the Irish Independent, "If we'd been a few minutes later, or Hitler had gotten a few more kicks to his old wounds, or he'd been shot, what would have happened if we hadn't intervened and he died?"
Sometimes the smallest moments in history can have the biggest impact.
In November 1923, a woman named Helena Hofstengel found herself alone with the distraught Hitler after the beer hall pushed, his failed attempt to overthrow the Weimar government. Hitler was contemplating suicide when she took his gun away and talked him out of it. Then, in 1931, Hitler escaped death again when he was involved in a car accident in Munich, and that's not even counting the whopping 42 assassination attempts he somehow miraculously survived. Chris Cleave's debut novel, Incendiary, is a heartbreaking story about a mother grieving the loss of her husband and sons during a terrorist attack on London. It was released on July 7, 2005, the same day 4 terrorists detonated bombs in London's underground and on a bus, killing 52 and wounding nearly 2,000. Cleve told NPR, "As the injured started to pour out of the tube and concerned friends began to ring, I realized this has really happened. I wondered if, by some kind of awful magic, I had caused this thing to happen. By imagining a terrorist attack so vividly in my book, I made it come to pass?" To coincide with the book's release, there were posters throughout the underground depicting London on fire, along with the words, "What if?" On his blog, Cleve wrote, "I cringe to remember it. My God, really? What were we thinking?" It's one of the great mysteries. If bears aren't friendly, why are they friend-shaped? Bears might be fluffy and cute, but on August 12, 1967, a bizarre set of coincidences proved that to be a mere disguise. On that day, in two entirely different areas of Glacier National Park, two very different bears attacked two 19-year-old girls on two separate camping trips.
It was absolutely a shock because it was the first time within anyone's memory that anyone had been killed in the park.
Michelle Coons was camping with friends when a bear showed up at their camp in the middle of the night. She was trapped in her sleeping bag, and the others were forced to listen as she was torn apart. Park rangers later shot and killed the bear that was acting strangely. Blonde hair found in the bear's stomach confirmed it was the killer. That same night, Julie Helgeson was camping with a friend when they were attacked.
I remember Julie whispering to me, "Play dead."
She was dragged away, and although she was alive when rescuers found her, she died from her injuries. Coincidence, perhaps, but former Ranger Dave Shea wasn't entirely surprised.
It was basically an incident waiting to happen.
He told the Great Falls Tribune that the first bear, who was known to regularly approach people, was clearly sick. Then there was all the garbage littering the park, often deliberately placed to lure bears within gawking range of tourists. Shea explained, "Obviously, the bears weren't being treated with the right respect." It was August 25, 1814. The British were marching on Washington. President Madison and his wife Dolly were getting ready to leave town, and the enemy army was getting their torches ready.
The shit's going down. Like, I can hear cannons going off. I can hear the shit happening.
The day was insanely hot, with temperatures reaching 100 degrees before the British started setting the city on fire. But that's when the tornado hit. It formed right in the middle of the city, smashing into British troops headed to Capitol Hill and tossing cannons aside like toys. The tornado brought a thunderstorm that put out the fires the British had started. Not only did the storm halt a lot of the damage that could have been done, but British forces abandoned the city after only 26 hours. Saying you were there for the first shot and the last shot of a war sounds like the kind of boast that only happens after drinks have been flowing. But in the case of Wilmer McLean, it's totally legit. In July 1861, McLean turned use of his Virginia home over to General P.G.T. Beauregard, who was gearing up for the First Battle of Bull Run, aka Manassas, when a cannonball crashed through his kitchen. In his diary, the general wrote, "A comical effect of this artillery fight was the destruction of the dinner of myself and staff by a Federal shell that fell into the fireplace of my headquarters at the McLean house." McLean may have been less inclined to see the humor, but there you go. Fast forward to McLean moving his family to a cottage in Appomattox County, where he was certain they'd be far away from the fighting. Unfortunately, not only was he right in the middle of the final skirmishes of the war, but when it came time for officials to choose a place for the end of the Civil War to be made official, they chose McLean's parlor. That's all well and good, but they didn't just sign the documents. The men looted the house for souvenirs afterwards. There's a famous quote associated with McLean: "The war began in my front yard and ended in my front parlor." Regardless of if he said it, it's true. Robert Todd Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln's oldest son, was an iconic figure, and one you would have thought twice about inviting to the theater back in the day.
Semper Tyrannis!
That's because he was up close and personal for no fewer than 3 presidential assassinations, so many that he even suspected he was cursed. He was supposed to be at Ford's Theater the night his father was assassinated, but told his parents he was going to turn in early instead. He was at the president's side when he died the next morning. In 1881, he accepted the position of Secretary of War from President James Garfield. On July 2nd of that year, Garfield was shot at the Baltimore and Potomac train station in Washington, D.C. Lincoln was walking about 40 feet behind the president when it happened. Garfield died from his injuries 80 days later. Lincoln gave up politics and became president of the Pullman Palace Car Company. In 1901, he and his family decided to visit Buffalo, New York's Pan American Exposition. When he got off the train, he was handed a telegram informing him that President McKinley had just been shot at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo. The fact that 6 monumental events in German history have taken place on November 9th is enough of a coincidence that the whole country should eyeball the calendar every time it rolls around. It started in 1848 with the execution of Robert Blum. You might not know the name, but he was a crusader for democracy throughout the German-speaking world. He was shot in Austria as an example to any democracy-minded Austrians. Fast forward to November 9, 1918, the day Germany's first democracy, the Weimar Republic, was established.
The Weimar Republic was a progressive, liberal democracy.
5 years later, on November 9, 1923, Adolf Hitler and his followers tried to overthrow the Weimar Republic with the Beer Hall Putsch. And while that failed, we all know what happened next. 2 years later, also on November 9th, Hitler created his stormtroopers, the SS. And if it wasn't exactly on November 9th, it was certainly made aware that on the 9th of November the SS existed, just in case someone fact-checks that. But we're not done. November 9th, 1938 was known as Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass, when the Nazis unleashed hell on Jews across the country, permanently marking this date as one of the most notorious in German history.
They stormed into synagogues, ripping out the benches, bimas, and Torah scrolls and throwing them into bonfires.
And finally, November 9th, 1989 is the day the Berlin Wall finally fell. Normally, that's a kind of thing that would become a national holiday, but the dark history of the date is far too loaded. Everyone knows what happened between Abraham Lincoln and John Wilkes Booth, but the Lincoln family and the Booth family overlapped in other strange ways. About a year before Lincoln's assassination, his son Robert Todd was standing on a crowded train platform in Jersey City. Robert fell in front of an approaching train and would have died had a man not grabbed him and hauled him to safety. When he turned to look, he recognized the man as actor and brother to John Wilkes, Edwin Booth. Robert later wrote, "I expressed my gratitude to him and in doing so called him by name." Booth, however, didn't recognize the president's son. It was only later that he received a letter from his friend, Colonel Adam Badeau, who was serving alongside Robert, telling Booth he'd saved the life of the younger Lincoln. But Badeau almost wasn't around to send that letter. He'd nearly died in the New York anti-draft riots in 1863. The man who saved his life? John Wilkes Booth. Leonard Dahl was the headmaster of the Strand School in Surrey, and he loved crosswords, so much that he'd been writing them for the Telegraph since 1925. In June 1944, though, he was at work when a very official-looking car pulled up, and he was escorted out of the school by agents from MI5. He returned a few days later and refused to say a word about what happened for the next 14 years. June 6, 1944 was D-Day, but the preparations had been going on for months. So when an MI5 officer who was trying to relax with a crossword puzzle started finding clues like Utah, Overlord, Juneau, Omaha, Neptune, and Mulberry, which happened to all be code words for various parts of Operation Overlord, he was alarmed. It looked like the crossword constructor was trying to pass intelligence to the enemy. But the explanation was weirdly innocent. It turns out Dahl wrote his crossword by giving his students blank layouts, asking them to fill in words, and then writing the clues after the fact. Unfortunately for him, the boys had been hanging out with some soldiers stationed nearby, and they'd written down some of these seemingly random words they'd overheard. So here's a weird one. Well, they're all pretty weird, but this one's super weird. It starts with a tragic story of the SS Myron. Captain Walter R. Neal was at the helm when the ship set off across the Great Lakes on November 22, 1919. And as Gordon Lightfoot fans know, that's a terrible time to sail the Great Lakes. She was headed for Buffalo, New York, with another ship in tow, the Miztec. The Myron and the Miztec got into serious trouble during a storm, and even after cutting the Miztec free, the Myron sank. In spite of rescue attempts from nearby ships, the Myron's entire crew perished, except for Captain Neal, who survived when the pilot house broke free. The Miztec stayed afloat. In the aftermath, Neal had strong words for those he felt had failed to save his crew, and after some shocking accusations, 2 captains lost their licenses. Neal ended up back on the waters of the Great Lakes. This time, he was the first mate on a ship called the Zilla, and in May 1921, the Zilla was back where the Myron had gone down. And so, coincidentally, was the Miztec. When a spring storm moved through, the Miztec sank just a stone's throw from the wreck of the Myron. All hands were lost as the Myron's former captain looked on. Oh, and the date? It was Friday the 13th. The story begins in 1921 with J.G. Tierney. He traveled across the American West until he ended up working on a massive project, building a new dam along the Colorado River. Tierney was part of the scouting party looking for the best location to build. Historian Dennis McBride explained to the Las Vegas Review-Journal that it would have been a dangerous job, saying, "The Colorado was just an unfettered river all the way from the Grand Canyon to Yuma. It would have been a wild river with terrific flooding." On December 20th, 1921, Tierney was killed in one of those floods, becoming the first person to die during the construction of what would become the Hoover Dam. His body was never recovered, and his grieving widow never stopped inquiring every time remains were found. She and her young son Patrick moved to Missouri, where he grew up, got married, and had a child of his own. By that time, the Great Depression was in full swing, and desperate to find work and support his family, Patrick Tierney moved west. Against the wishes of his mother, he got a job as an electrician on the Hoover Dam project. Turns out that sometimes mothers do know best. Patrick was killed when he fell from one of the dam's towers. It was December 20th, 1935, 14 years to the day that his father had died on the same project. At Belgium's Semporion Military Cemetery, there are 2 adjacent graves that mark the final resting place of both the first and last British soldier to die in World War I. The graves are separated by only 7 yards. Not only was this a complete accident, but it went unnoticed for decades. First was Private John Parr, a London teenager who joined the military at 14 and was sent to northern France. It's unclear how he died, but records show that he was a bicycle scout, and it's believed he was killed by a German cavalry patrol on August 21, 1914, 17 days after the war began. The last was Private George Ellison, who was also shot and killed while on patrol. He had enlisted, served his time, and moved on to life as a coal miner before being recalled into military service. He served a brutal 4 years, and the whole Ellison story is pretty tragic, but he died literally about an hour and a half before the official ceasefire to effectively end the war. And yes, it's totally random. Parr was buried by German soldiers in 1915, while Ellison's final resting place is actually his second one. It wasn't until the 1920s, when the Imperial War Graves Commission began overseeing the proper burial of fallen British soldiers, that he was laid to rest there. Thomas W. Lawson was a British stockbroker. In 1907, he published a book called Friday the 13th. It's the story of, surprise, a stockbroker who tries to make the stock market crash on, surprise again, Friday the 13th. The book was a big seller at the time. End of story? Not quite. Lawson's book was published 5 years after the construction of a 7-masted schooner also named the Thomas W. Lawson, although that was a different guy. The ship spent some time sailing up and down the US coast before making her first transatlantic voyage. She sank on Hellwether Reef off England's Scilly Islands, claiming the lives of 17 people. And the date? Friday, December 13, 1907.